Hi everybody, and welcome to the Dr. Psych Mom Show. Today I'm going to be talking about kind of an easy way, maybe not so easy, but an unexpected way that you can grow as a person. I know therapy is not for everybody, even though, of course, I'm a proponent, I'm a fan, but a different kind of way to introspect, and that is rereading or rewatching things that you read or watched when you were younger and seeing how you've changed. And I'm going to talk about that in depth after I tell you to subscribe. My most recent subscriber episode was a very practical, skills-oriented one about 4 conversation starters that you can use on date night or any other time to start different kind of conversations that are not just about logistics with your spouse. And people really appreciate having these more practical, strategic, kind of concrete episodes interspersed with the more philosophical ones. So I try to do that, and you should subscribe. There's that one, and close to 230 others. Okay, so obviously introspection, I believe, is useful. Otherwise, I wouldn't really be in the right profession. And one great way to introspect about yourself and what has changed in your perspective and, how your worldview has been impacted by age, stage of life, marriage, having kids, seeing your own parents age, all of that is rereading or rewatching things that you really loved reading or watching when you were young. And this could be a TV show, it could be a movie, and obviously reading books. And this often, and I do want to put in your journals. If you are a journal writer or you used to even write a diary when you were a child and you have those somewhere in a box in the basement, maybe that too. And that doesn't apply to everybody, but the other one does. Everybody's watched TV. Most people have read some books and movies. But some of you have also journaled, and that's also awesome as a catalyst of growth to look back through that. But let's just look at the reading a book. So what's an example? For myself personally, I'm a big reader. As you know, I'm always recommending books. And a lot of books I read before I even had children. And I identified so much with the child character. And now when I reread them, I identify much more with the parent. And it's interesting how, looking at that change, it impacts you, thinking like, wow, I've really grown a lot in this time in these ways. And how do I think that I'll grow in the future? So one example is A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. That's one of my favorite books. And I used to super identify only with Francie, the main character. This is a book that many of you may have read. And now when I look at it, I identify with Katie, the mother. And Katie really seemed like a bitch, honestly, when I was reading it the first time, She seemed like she just wasn't magical and romantic enough, And Johnny, the father, who is an alcoholic, well, he seemed to be a very magical character that was so wonderful. And, poor guy, and it was Francie, the guy who really, Francie loved her father so much and she didn't get along so well with her mother. And I look back at it now, obviously I've also worked with many couples who struggle with a partner being addicted. And all of these, by the way, Betty Smith's biography, she's the author, and this book is pretty much autobiographical as much as most novels are, really. Many novels are. And if you look her up, you see that there's a profound amount of overlap between her and Francie. So it's really interesting on that level as well, because it's a real story. Or it's very similar to a real story. And so when I look at it now, I'm like, man, Katie was poor. And she's struggling with a husband who is really charming, but really doesn't bring in any money, has this alcohol problem. She's on her hands and knees scrubbing to make money. And then of course, she's going to become quite a bitch, isn't she? I mean, she is not going to be too magical because her life is not very magical. And it's interesting to see that how your perspective shifts over time. And then also to think, well, I guess my children would feel like, like Francie. And so how did Francie think about Katie? And how would I have thought about Katie? And it can really, in that example, make you identify with both characters. So then the children still want the parent, even though they're taking care of everything, to be, more into them and more engaged and not so stressed out all the time. Even when I now realize she had a hell of a reason to be stressed out, much more than I, really took in when I read it as a younger person. And I mean, a lot of that work, if you really introspect about something and how you have grown and changed over time, that's like a few therapy sessions, and you just did it for yourself right there. But I mean, you would have to put in the work. It's not just rewatching and being like, oh yeah, I really like that. I still like it. like that's not that kind of stuff. It's more like, can you see something and see how you were wrong in some sort of way? And maybe I'll be, identify with the grandmother eventually, who you only really see, I think the name was Mary at the beginning of the book. But, your perspective is always shifting. And what do you learn about yourself? What can you say were blind spots in your past, that now this book points out to you? It's also a really amazing way to understand that you're not always right, So however I think about it now, I may think totally different about the book, and I probably will in 5, 10, 15, 20 years. Or in this case, I read that book when I was like a child, so in 40 years. And so I was a precocious child. I started reading it far before I should. I read all these books with sex scenes way before I should have, because I was just always reading everything around the house. But the point is, that if you can understand, wow, I really thought I understood everything about this book, about this movie, what have you, when I was young, but I really didn't. So then it can make you understand that now your perspective is also not infallible, and you are always in a process of flux and growth. So for example, the Wonder Years, that was another one where obviously as a child, I identified with a child. That was hard enough because he was a boy, right? So I'm identifying with a little boy, but I was a little girl. So that's pretty close, And now when I watch it, I'm like, wow, the parents. I first of all think that the dad had depression, definitely. Probably had PTSD. He had been in the war. And he was just sitting there all the time. The marriage was not great. And remember that whole thing where she was trying to take a sculpting class? Anybody a big fan of this show? And then he became such an asshole about it because she was taking time away from the family. And that was a really interesting episode from the perspective of somebody who's now a mother in midlife, just like she was, and has 3 children, just like she did. And she's trying to balance all these things, and then she's trying to do a little something for herself. And of course, it speaks to the gender norms of the times and all of that. And now, if you want, and then of course on that, he didn't understand anything about his mother. And it really, at the time, I felt like I really did understand that, the parents were just parents. And if they would have said, do you understand the parents? I would have said, yeah, I understand the parents. I didn't understand shit about what was going on with the parents. And I didn't understand how the parents would have been thinking about the kids. I mean, Wayne, in and of himself, would have been such a trial. I'm sure that really contributed to the father's depression, quite honestly, because Wayne seems to have had untreated ADHD, ODD, who knows what he had, but that sibling bullying also is treated a lot differently nowadays than it was then. It's pretty hardcore in that show, how much Wayne goes after Kevin all the time, and the parents would just say, knock it off. Nowadays, that's treated as like assault, a lot of that stuff, and sibling bullying is recognized as real. And so for somebody that did experience sibling bullying and watched the Wonder Years, it would be really interesting. I was an only child, so I mean, I don't have a personal skin in that game, but you might if you're a sibling that was unhappy with how a sibling treated you. You should rewatch that show and see what you think. And see how your perspective has shifted over time. What about the older sister, the hippie? I didn't really understand what was going on there and all of her ambivalence about, being good and being the girl that they wanted versus her own independence and the changing times and the mores and all of that. Either way, it's really, really interesting. I do this all the time, reread stuff, rewatch stuff. And if you want extra credit to bond with your partner, you can pick something that you guys used to watch when you were young, even individually, a show that you both watched as a kid, for example, or a book that you both read, and reread it and say, how did your perspective change? And have basically an interesting discussion that isn't anything about day-to-day logistics or boring stuff, but instead is about, man, I used to think this, now I think this. How does that make me feel? Right? Like, how does it make me feel to have a whole new perspective now that I identify with like the mother in this? I mean, my so-called life, the mother was having basically a midlife crisis. She used to be the beautiful one. Now her daughter's a teenager and nobody's really looking at her anymore. I mean, definitely identifiable for any woman who has a daughter. But yet, she was such a minor character when we watched it at first. Just all about Claire Danes and whether she was going to get Jared Leto, wasn't it? And and now you could look back and say, wow, that marriage was really under duress. I mean, you remember what happened last episode of that, right? With the dad. Well, if you don't, you should rewatch it. All right. So anywho, this is just something that I think is obviously a free way to engage in deeper self-reflection, to think about who you are, how you became how you are. Remember that these shows also shape us. I was not watching A Happy Marriage at home in my house, so a lot of these shows were a template for what a happy marriage should look like. But maybe they weren't so happy. Maybe they were, not realistic. Like, in what ways was, were the parent characters realistic or not? In what ways did I notice anything? And now I would notice it differently and say, oh, I guess that marriage really was struggling with this, this, and this. Almost all of those shows, by the way, 90210, My So-Called Life, I mean, all of them that I can, obviously The Wonder Years, they all had marital problems at some point as an episode. And those episodes we kind of glossed over as kids. They weren't that interesting because these people are in their 40s, might as well be in their grave, that's how a young person thinks. So those, almost like you would fast forward. I mean, it was live TV, but it was almost like emotionally you weren't really in it as much. So that's why it's really interesting to go back, because those were being directed and produced and written by older people. And those people were engaging in these midlife issues in their own lives, and that was what was coming up, and that was what was relevant. So it is interesting to think about how did these, same motifs recur now, which ones change with the differences. I mean, none of those dads were doing anything around the house much at all. Sometimes if they were particularly bohemian and creative, they would cook a meal, but that was about it. So that's interesting too. There's also so much, even if you're uncomfortable with the deeper psychological introspection, even watching it to say, how have things changed and how is that interesting? And to show your kids. I show some of these shows to my kids and they're shocked consistently by things that I wouldn't even know that they would be shocked at. Like what was allowed in the schools, or how much freedom was allowed at home, or how much people were socializing just on the regular, just constantly. Like My So-Called Life, the mother's hanging out with her best friend all the time every day, even though she was working. When does that happen now? That never happens. People don't just come over every day and hang out in somebody's kitchen. But that used to happen more. That wasn't just TV. People used to spend, the data reflects this, so much more time with their friends than they do now. And anyway, it's really, really an interesting idea. It's the summer, so you may have a little bit more time, a little bit more bandwidth, and it is an interesting way to spark some internal reflection as well as external interesting conversation with a spouse or even with your kids, as I said. All right, I hope you enjoyed this, and I will talk to everybody soon. Bye-bye.